The year is 1099. The siege of Jerusalem lasted for 1 month and 8 days. The crusader army finally captured the city and subsequently founded the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Hundreds of men, women, and children, both Muslim and Jewish, perished in the general slaughter that followed. Against the odds, this struggling, fractious, and naive enterprise had made its way from Western Europe to the Middle East and conquered 2 of the best defended cities of the time. For medieval men and women, the agent of victory was God himself. It was this firm belief that would sustain centuries of crusading. From 969, the Fatimid dynasty controlled parts of North Africa and Western Asia, including Jerusalem, Damascus, and some Mediterranean coasts. They had a relatively peaceful relationship with the West. However, in 1073, they lost Jerusalem to the Seljuk dynasty, a new power in the region. The Seljuks were a high medieval empire with a Turco-Persian culture. Their empire covered 3.9 million square kilometers, stretching from Anatolia and the Levant in the west to the Hindu Kush in the east. The Seljuks originated from near the Aral Sea and first expanded into Khorasan and then into Iran. The Seljuk invasion of eastern Anatolia sparked the Byzantine-Seljuk Wars, in which the Seljuks gained the upper hand after the Battle of Manzikert in 1071. Byzantine Emperor Alexios Komnenos, worried about the advances of the Seljuks into his territory, sent envoys to the Council of Piacenza in March 1095 to ask Pope Urban for aid against the invading Turks. Pope Urban's predecessor, Gregory, wanted to reform the church and limit the secular influence of the emperors, while the Holy Roman Emperor Henry wanted to maintain his authority over the church in his realm. Gregory excommunicated Henry twice, and Henry invaded Rome and deposed Gregory, replacing him with an antipope. When Urban succeeded Gregory, he was in continuous struggle for authority. He was usually kept away from Rome and toured northern Italy and France. There was also the ongoing break of communion between the Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox churches since 1054. When Urban received the request for help by the Byzantine emperor, he saw that as a chance to strengthen his position. In July 1095, Urban turned to his homeland of France to recruit men for the expedition. His travels there culminated in the 10-day Council of Clermont, where on the 27th of November, he gave an impassioned sermon to a large audience of French nobles and clergy, and promised forgiveness and pardon for all of the past sins of those who would fight to reclaim the Holy Land from Muslims and free the Eastern churches. Calling for a crusade at the Council of Clermont in 1095, Pope Urban planned the departure for the 15th of August 1096. Nevertheless, a number of unexpected bands of peasants and low-ranking knights organized and set off for Jerusalem on their own. The peasant population had been afflicted by drought, famine, and disease for many years before 1096, and some of them seemed to have envisioned the crusade as an escape from these hardships. A charismatic monk and powerful orator named Peter the Hermit was the spiritual leader of the movement. He had vigorously preached the crusade throughout northern France and Flanders. He claimed to have been appointed to preach by Christ himself. It is commonly believed that Peter's followers consisted entirely of a massive group of untrained and illiterate peasants who did not even know where Jerusalem was. But there were also many knights among the peasants, including Walter Saint-Savoy, who was lieutenant to Peter and led a separate army. The preaching of the First Crusade inspired an outbreak of anti-Jewish violence. In parts of France and Germany, Jews were perceived as just as much of an enemy as Muslims. In June and July 1095, Jewish communities in the Rhineland were attacked. On top of the general Catholic suspicion of Jews at the time, when the thousands of French members of the People's Crusade arrived at the Rhine, they had run out of provisions. To restock their supplies, they began to plunder Jewish food and property while attempting to force them to convert to Catholicism. Lacking military discipline, Peter's fledgling army quickly found itself in trouble despite the fact they were still in Christian territory. The army led by Walter plundered the Belgrade and Zemun areas and arrived in Constantinople with little resistance. Meanwhile, the army led by Peter, which marched separately from Walter's army, also fought with the Hungarians. Peter arrived at Constantinople in August, where his army joined with the one led by Walter. Peter's and Walter's unruly mob began to pillage outside the city in search of supplies and food, prompting Alexios to hurriedly ferry the gathering across the Bosporus 1 week later. After crossing into Asia Minor, the Crusaders split up and began to pillage the countryside, wandering into Seljuk territory around Nicaea. The far more experienced Turks massacred most of this group. The Turkish archers destroyed the Crusader army, and Walter was among the dead. Left in Constantinople with the small number of surviving followers, the People's Crusade awaited the coming of the armed crusaders. Recruitment for such a large enterprise was continent-wide. Estimates as to the size of the Crusader armies have been given as 70 to 80,000 on the number who left Western Europe in the year after Clermont, and more joined in the 3-year duration. Urban's speech had been well planned. He had discussed the crusade with Adhemar of Le Puy and Raymond IV, Count of Toulouse, and instantly the expedition had the support of 2 of southern France's most important leaders. Other leaders Urban recruited throughout 1096 included Bohemond of Taranto, a southern Italian ally of the Reform popes, Bohemond's nephew Tancred, Godfrey of Bouillon, who had previously been an anti-reform ally of the Holy Roman Emperor, his brothers Baldwin of Boulogne and Eustace Count of Boulogne, Hugh Herman, Count of Vermandois, brother of the excommunicated King of France, Robert Curthose, brother of King of England, and his relative Robert Count of Flanders. The Crusaders represented northern and southern France, Flanders, Germany, and southern Italy, and so were divided into 4 separate armies that were not always cooperative, though they were held together by their common ultimate goal. The 4 main Crusader armies left Europe around the appointed time in August 1096. They took different routes to Constantinople, some through Eastern Europe and the Balkans, some crossing the Adriatic Sea. King of Hungary allowed Godfrey and his troops to cross Hungary only after his brother Baldwin was offered as a hostage to guarantee his troops' good conduct. The armies arrived in Constantinople with little food and expected provisions and help from Alexios. Alexios was understandably suspicious after his experiences with the People's Crusade, and also because the knights included his old Norman enemy, Bohemond, who had invaded Byzantine territory on numerous occasions with his father. In return for food and supplies, Alexios requested the leaders to swear fealty to him and promised to return to the Byzantine Empire any land recovered from the Turks. Godfrey was the first to take the oath, and almost all the other leaders followed him. The Crusader armies crossed over into Asia Minor during the first half of 1097, where they were joined by Peter the Hermit and the remainder of his relatively small army. In addition, Alexios also sent 2 of his generals to assist the Crusaders. The first objective of their campaign was Nicaea, a city once under Byzantine rule, but which had become the capital of the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum under Kilij Arslan. Arslan was away campaigning in central Anatolia at the time and had left behind his treasury and his family. Upon the Crusaders' arrival on the 14th of May 1097, the city was subjected to siege, and when Arslan had word of it, he rushed back and attacked the Crusader army on the 16th of May. He was driven back by the unexpectedly large Crusader force, with heavy losses being suffered on both sides in the ensuing battle. The siege continued, but the Crusaders had little success as they found they could not blockade Lake Iznik. To break the city, Alexios had the Crusaders' ships rolled over land on logs. The Turkish garrison finally surrendered on the 18th of June. There was some discontent amongst the Franks who were forbidden from looting the city. At the end of June, the Crusaders marched on through Anatolia. The Normans, who had marched ahead of the French, were attacked by Kilij Arslan. Arslan had gathered a much larger army than he previously had after his defeat, and now surrounded the Normans with his fast-moving mounted archers. The Normans deployed in a tight-knit defensive formation, surrounding all their equipment and the non-combatants, and sent for help from the other group. The archers did little damage to the heavily armoured knights, which Turks called the Men of Iron, but inflicted heavy casualties on their horses and on the unarmoured foot soldiers. When the French arrived, Godfrey broke through the Turkish lines, and the legate Adhemar outflanked the Turks from the rear. The Turks, who had not anticipated the quick arrival of the French, fled rather than face the combined Crusader army. The Crusaders' march through Anatolia was thereafter unopposed, but the journey was unpleasant, as Arslan had burned and destroyed everything he left behind in his army's flight. It was the middle of summer, and the Crusaders had very little food and water. Many men and horses died. The Crusaders looted and pillaged whenever the opportunity presented itself. After passing through the Cilician gates, Baldwin broke away from the main body of the army and set off towards the Armenian lands. The Armenians welcomed Baldwin, and the local population massacred the Seljuks. The Armenian Lord Thoros of Edessa sent envoys to Baldwin, seeking his assistance against the nearby Seljuks. Reaching the city, he was well received by both Thoros and the local Christian population. Remarkably, Thoros adopted Baldwin as a son, making him co-regent of Edessa. Strengthened by troops from Edessa, Baldwin raided Seljuk territory and placed a garrison in a small fortress. Shortly after Baldwin's return from the campaign, a riot broke out in the town, forcing Thoros to take refuge in the citadel. Baldwin pledged to save his adoptive father, but when the rioters broke into the citadel on the 9th of March and murdered both Thoros and his wife, he did nothing to stop them. On the following day, after the townspeople acknowledged Baldwin as their ruler, he assumed the title of Count of Edessa and so established the first of the Crusader states. Antioch lay in a strategic location on the Crusaders' route to Palestine through the Syrian coastal mountain range. Supplies, reinforcements and retreat could all be controlled by the city. Anticipating that it would be attacked, the Seljuk governor of the city began stockpiling food and sending requests for help. The Crusaders arrived outside the city on the 21st of October and began the siege. After stripping the surrounding area of food, the Crusaders were forced to look farther afield for supplies. On the 31st of December, a force of 20,000 Crusaders encountered a relief army led by ruler of Damascus heading to Antioch and defeated them. As the siege went on, supplies dwindled. The Crusaders concluded that they would have to take the city before the Seljuk army arrived if they had any chance of survival. Weeks earlier, Bohemond had secretly established contact with someone inside the city who offered to let Bohemond in exchange for money and a title. On the night of the 2nd of June, the traitor on the watchtower allowed a small contingent of Crusaders to scale the tower and open a nearby gate. Bohemond captured the citadel. In the ensuing chaos, the Armenians and Greeks joined the Crusaders in fighting the Turks they could find, although the deaths also included many non-Turkish civilians. Seljuk army arrived 2 days later, tried and failed to storm the city, and by the 9th of June established their own siege. Morale inside the city was low and defeat looked imminent, but a peasant visionary called Peter Bartholomew claimed the apostle St. Andrew came to him to show the location of the Holy Lance that had pierced Christ on the cross. They began to dig in the Cathedral of St. Peter on the 15th of June, and when they came up empty, Peter went into the pit, reached down and produced a spear point. Raymond took this as a divine sign that they would survive, and thus prepared for a final fight rather than surrender. On Monday the 28th of June, the Crusaders emerged from the city gate, carrying the Holy Lance before them. They marched in 4 battle groups to engage the enemy. Crusaders charged with their heavy cavalry and breaking the lightly armed Turkish cavalry, while many of Seljuk allies deserted them seeing this. The battle was brief and disastrous for the Seljuk Empire. Soon the defeated Turkish troops were in panicked retreat. As expected, Bohemond claimed the city as his own, although Adhemar and Raymond disagreed. Soon an epidemic broke out, possibly of typhus, and on the 1st of August Adhemar of Lipui died. For the rest of 1098, they took control of the countryside surrounding Antioch. At the beginning of 1099, the march was renewed, leaving Bohemond behind as the first prince of Antioch. Proceeding down the Mediterranean coast, the Crusaders encountered little resistance. In January, Raymond dismantled the walls of Marat al-Numan. Various sources suggest that, driven by hunger, some of the starving Crusaders at Mahara resorted to cannibalism, feeding on the bodies of Muslims. Raymond planned to take Tripoli to set up a state equivalent to Antioch, but first initiated a siege of Acre. The situation was tense, not only among the military leaders, but also among the clergy. And ever since the discovery of the Holy Lance, there had been accusations of fraud among the clerical factions. On the 8th of April, Peter Bartholomew was challenged to an ordeal by fire. Peter underwent the ordeal and died after days of agony from his wounds, which discredited the Holy Lance as a fake. This also undermined Raymond's authority over the crusade, as he was the main proponent of its authenticity. The siege of Acre lasted until the 13th of May, when the Crusaders left having captured nothing. On the 7th of June, the Crusaders reached Jerusalem. Many Crusaders wept upon seeing the city they had journeyed so long to reach. The Crusaders' arrival at Jerusalem revealed an arid countryside, lacking in water or food supplies. Here there was no prospect of relief, even as they feared an imminent attack by the local Fatimid rulers. There was no hope of trying to blockade the city as they had at Antioch. The Crusaders had insufficient troops, supplies, and time. Rather, they resolved to take the city by assault. Thus began the decisive siege of Jerusalem. While Godfrey and Tancred made camp to the north of the city, Raymond made his to the south. The final assault on Jerusalem began on the 13th of July. Raymond's troops attacked the south gate, while the other contingents attacked the northern wall. On the 15th of July, a final push was launched at both ends of the city, and eventually, the inner rampart of the northern wall was captured. The slaughter continued for the rest of the day. Muslims were indiscriminately killed, and Jews who had taken refuge in their synagogue died when it was burnt down by the Crusaders. On the 22nd of July, a council was held in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre to establish governance for Jerusalem. Godfrey was then elected leader, accepting the title Defender of the Holy Sepulchre. Pope Urban died on the 29th of July 1099, 14 days after the capture of Jerusalem by the crusaders, but before news of the event had reached Rome. In August 1099, Fatimid vizier landed a force of 20,000 North Africans at Ascalon. Geoffrey and Raymond marched out to meet this force on the 9th of August, with a force of only 1,200 knights and 9,000 foot soldiers. Outnumbered 2 to 1, the Franks launched a surprise dawn attack and routed the overconfident and unprepared Muslim force. After the battle, almost all of the remaining crusaders returned to their homes in Europe, their vows of pilgrimage having been fulfilled. There were perhaps only a few hundred knights left in Jerusalem by the end of the year, but they were gradually reinforced by new crusaders, inspired by the success of the original crusade.